Do you know that by now, if Tesla had his way, we would have had free electricity? No electric bill, no wastage, no debt, just pure, green, free electricity. Tesla figured out a way to provide free green electricity using the Great Pyramid in Egypt, which would have revolutionized the world. Up until that point, the world had believed that the Great Pyramid of Giza was simply a tomb for ancient pharaohs. However, Tesla discovered that this was not the case at all, as internal evidence seemed to suggest that the Great Pyramid was an ancient power plant instead. Stunned by this discovery, Tesla's interest in the Great Pyramid eventually grew into an obsession that led to tons of research work and the Tesla Tower. But his vision never became a reality. Not only was Tesla's invention stopped by the powers that may be, which you will see in a moment, but after his death, everything regarding his research was seized by the US government and was never disclosed. Until now, we still pay for what should have been free. This is a story you really want to hear. Tesla spent a good portion of his life researching the pyramids. Up to that point, and even till now, we had been told that the pyramids were simply royal tombs, case closed. However, as Tesla began his research, he found that his studies were leading him to a completely different conclusion. There were more to these pyramids than the experts were letting on. You see, at the time, Tesla had been working on an idea to help transfer energy wirelessly. Tesla strongly believed that if we could leverage resonant frequencies and electromagnetic waves, we could come up with a way for the entire world to enjoy free and unlimited electricity. Tesla's idea involved building a network of towers and then turning all of these towers to the same frequency. Once at this uniform frequency, Tesla believed that the towers would create a resonant system that would help to amplify power and transmit that power across long distances without the use of wires or cables. This is essentially what the Wardenclyffe project was about. The way Tesla saw it, the Earth was like a giant battery, storing a limitless amount of free electrical energy, just waiting to be harnessed. And from his research, the Great Pyramid seemed to have done just that, harnessed the Earth's ionosphere to generate electricity. And this made Tesla wonder if there wasn't some kind of advanced tech hidden in this pyramid. He already had a theory that the Great Pyramid was very likely built using crystal energy, which had the ability to control electromagnetic fields, the foundation of wireless electricity. Tesla also believed that the Great Pyramid was constructed with materials that made it possible for it to absorb a lot of energy from the sun and moon. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot, enough to power whole cities. All of these intriguing observations led Tesla to the conclusion that the Great Pyramid was not just a tomb, but was actually a gigantic power plant. Some even say that Tesla believed the pyramid was somewhat related to cosmic energy, and thus could help with spiritual enlightenment and healing. Naturally, most people found Tesla's pyramid theories outlandish and eccentric, but Tesla wasn't just whipping them out of thin air. The man spent a good portion of his life studying every single thing he could lay his hands on about pyramids, from hieroglyphs to texts to drawings and ancient artifacts. Besides, even modern-day scientists and researchers have also begun to stumble on findings that corroborate Tesla's thoughts. You've probably heard of Christopher Dunn, a well-known mechanical engineer who helped popularize what is called the Giza power plant theory. Dunn's argument is quite similar to Tesla's. He believes that the Great Pyramid exhibits design and construction far ahead of the times in which it was constructed. But more to the point, Dunn believes that the Great Pyramid is not a tomb, but a highly sophisticated machine that leverages the natural vibrations of the Earth and other natural forces to generate and harness energy using a combination of mechanical, chemical, and acoustic technologies. To make his point, Dunn points out a number of unique and interesting characteristics of the Great Pyramid. Now, pay close attention. First is that the pyramid aligns perfectly with true north. Secondly, the pyramid was built with granite and limestone, two materials that are known to have piezoelectric properties. In other words, if you subject them to mechanical stress, they can produce an electric charge. The third thing that Dunn points out is the interior of the Great Pyramid. Now, let's take a trip there to see what Dunn means. If you ever get to enter into the Great Pyramid, let me tell you what you won't find: mummies or treasures. What you're going to find instead are interior chambers and passageways, what is called the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber, and the Queen's Chamber. Dunn theorizes that the Queen's Chamber contained a mixture of chemicals, specifically hydrated zinc chloride and hydrochloric acid, which were mixed together to produce hydrogen gas. Once produced, this hydrogen gas was passed into the King's Chamber through a couple of shafts, and the King's Chamber, with its granite construction, was where the resonance happened. Now, the traveling hydrogen gas finally gets into the King's Chamber, and when it gets there, it interacts with the granite's piezoelectric properties, thereby creating a resonance effect. After that, the resonance effect would amplify the Earth's natural vibrations, which would then lead to the production of energy that would then be transmitted and used to power ancient machinery, or maybe even light bulbs. Yes, you heard right, light bulbs. In one of the best preserved ancient temples of Egypt is a hieroglyph that seems to portray what looks like an ancient light bulb, proving the existence of electricity in ancient Egypt. There's a giant transparent bulb with a snake inside that looks like a filament, and a cord that appears to be plugged into something that looks like a battery. And many have said that this is a depiction of how the ancient Egyptians created the first light bulb. Now, here's what makes this mysterious hieroglyph even more intriguing. Later reconstructions of this image, found on the walls of the Dendera temple, proved that the device depicted was capable of producing electricity, at least in theory. Not to forget that ancient Egyptian temples, as well as pyramids, show no evidence of soot marks from torches or oil lamps. So were the Egyptians the actual inventors of electricity? While you chew on that, let's round off this section of the video nicely with something called the telluric grid theory. If you've never heard of it before, it's a theory that proposes that ancient civilizations had an understanding of static electricity and the natural flow of electricity through the earth, which they learned to tap into and even control. According to this school of thought, this is what all these unexplained giant ancient megalithic structures are all about. The telluric grid theory proposes that ancient pyramids and temples were built to artificially alter the natural electrical environment, pointing out ancient cultures' use of something called geomancy, or geomantic art. A good example of geomantic practices that have survived to this day is feng shui, which is the Chinese art of placement. Through history, we observe that ancient cultures seem to be obsessed with building imposing structures at just the right place, height, shape, angle, and whatnot. It reminds you of how we build radio towers in our modern times. According to the telluric grid theory, the ancient civilizations combined orientation, position, and atmospheric static electricity that was typically gathered at an altitude. They then used the resulting combo to create something like an electric funnel into and out of the earth. Now, we don't know what the ancients used the electricity they generated to do, but it is theorized that over time the ancients continued to build more and more of these megalithic structures all over the world, forming the telluric grid, or geomagnetic grid. The theory also proposes that these structures either controlled the overall flow of Earth's energies together, or simply performed these tasks on a local scale in individual villages and communities. Now, as cool as the pyramid power station theory might sound, you should know that there are quite a few reasonable arguments against it that make the theory a little difficult to accept at face value. For one, there is neither archaeological nor textual evidence to support the theory of the existence of electricity in ancient Egypt. Unfortunately for many believers, the Dendera light bulb myth seems to demonstrate the "it looks like" fallacy, rather than prove that the ancient Egyptians had electricity. The truth is that the fact that the Dendera hieroglyph looks like a light bulb does not necessarily mean that it was a light bulb. Plus, Egyptologists have confirmed that the hieroglyph is actually a depiction of the Egyptian creation myth, not how ancient Egypt invented the first light bulb. The so-called light bulb is actually the world blooming from a lotus flower, and the snake in the center is not a light bulb filament, but a representation of Atum, an Egyptian deity. The other figures in the relief are also elements from Egypt's religious iconography, like the D-shaped pillar, which is a symbol of stability and not a primitive Tesla coil. Another problem with the pyramid power station theory is that it fails to account for the other pyramids of ancient Egypt and indeed other parts of the world. When you take a look at the interior of the Great Pyramid, it is vastly different from other pyramids at Giza. So would that mean that the Great Pyramid was built as a power station while the rest were built as tombs? And if the answer to that is yes, then it brings up another question. Why? Why was it only the Great Pyramid that was used to generate electricity? There are 2 other Great Pyramids, not to mention the dozens of other pyramids around Giza and Egypt, and we also have pyramids in Sudan. Why weren't these other pyramids also used to generate electricity? Keep in mind that the Great Pyramid wasn't the first or the last pyramid to be built in Egypt. Several were built before it, and many were built after it, but all of them were used as tombs. So why was the Great Pyramid the only power plant? Why weren't more power plants built? Even if the chief engineer had died, he would have had notes and assistants. Why didn't the assistants just follow his notes and recreate more of these plants to light up the ancient world? Why did the ancient Egyptians spend 100 years building the Giza area, only to fill it with expensive tombs instead of installing more power plants and lighting up all of Egypt with light bulbs? And by the way, a light bulb might look fairly simple to make, but it needs high-quality glass and wiring that we don't have evidence that ancient Egypt had access to. But you know what? For a lark, let's say that the ancient Egyptians did discover electricity and invented the light bulb. Even that brings up yet another confusion. What were the light bulbs created to light? The Pharaoh's palace? But that was in Memphis, and Memphis is many miles away from Giza where the Great Pyramid sits. If they wanted to build a power plant to power the Pharaoh's palace, then the pyramid should have been close to the palace, not 20 miles away from it, in the middle of an already existing cemetery. Also, if electricity was indeed invented about 4,500 years ago by the Egyptians, then a number of accompanying inventions should have followed shortly after. For perspective, shortly after the light bulb was invented, appliances like the electric stove, microwaves, and electric fans were invented within the next 100 years. Yet, in ruins of ancient Egypt homes, we still see soot and oil stains during archaeological digs, suggesting that people still made use of oil lamps and torches. In fact, if the ancient Egyptians really did generate and transmit electricity at that time, then a lot of their day-to-day lives didn't really make any sense. For instance, why did they still make use of horses for transportation, or oxen for their farms? Why couldn't they dam the Nile's tributaries? The more you think about it, the more you realize that there's simply no explanation for why the ancient Egyptians would have spent all that time building such a remarkable structure to produce electricity, make such a remarkable invention like the light bulb, and then suddenly hit the brakes and stop inventing or innovating, especially since the 25th century BC was such a time of relative peace, stability, and prosperity for Egypt. Which leads to another point of disagreement. If the ancient Egyptians really did discover electricity, why didn't they conquer the world? You'd have to agree that discovering electricity is the sort of thing that would instantly make any nation a world power, especially at that time. And yet, oddly enough, there is no record of any nation going to war with Egypt to steal this power plant technology from them. It definitely couldn't be because Egypt kept it a secret, because clandestine projects are not usually 500 feet tall. Plus, you can't exactly hide electricity. Yet, in all of the records, there's no single mention of any other nation even knowing that Egypt had such world-changing technology, not to talk of going to war with them to steal the tech. Instead, what we have is Egypt enjoying a golden age of peace and prosperity that would last for over 200 years after the Great Pyramid was built. Not even one foreign threat or an attempt by nearby cultures to copy the invention. It's a little too strange, isn't it? But that's the thing about the Great Pyramid and why it's such a mystery. All of these points we've just looked at make the pyramid power plant theory sound so bogus. But what if I told you that a few years ago, a group of physicists from around the world were doing some work on the Great Pyramid, and they found that the pyramid can actually focus electromagnetic energy in its internal chambers and underneath its base? This automatically brings into question every scientific claim used to debunk Tesla's pyramid theory. But that's not even all. There's more. In the 70s, a book titled Earthlights was released. The book explained that many of the UFOs that humans have reported sighting were actually natural phenomena that were generated within the Earth's electric field. And before you ask, yes, this theory came with significant scientific evidence. For instance, U.S. Bureau of Mines scientist Dr. Brian Brady carried out tests on granite to study rock bursts. In his experiment, Dr. Brady put granite through 32,000 pounds of pressure and found that strange electrical balls and streaks started to bounce off of it, proving the basic theory of the book and showing that light-producing atmospheric phenomena can many times be traced to geological sources, perhaps through fault lines, tectonic activity, or geomagnetic activity. Of course, this is not conclusive proof that the Great Pyramid was a power station, but there is something else. Significant and respectable scientific evidence has shown us that rocks and other megalithic structures can have electrical purposes. In fact, mountains do interfere with Earth's atmospheric potential gradient, and by atmospheric potential gradient, we're referring to the difference in electric potential between the ground and the atmosphere. The ground is more negatively charged, while the atmosphere is more positively charged, and that difference between the two is what creates the Earth's electric field. Now, because mountains are tall, they bring the ground, which is negatively charged, closer to the atmosphere, which is positively charged. This effectively distorts the Earth's electric field, which is why you tend to observe a lot more lightning in mountainous areas. But more to the point, science tells us that mountains also have the ability to collect electric current from the atmosphere, again because of their height and the pointiness of their peaks. Now, if this is true, and science has shown us that it is, then couldn't it be that the telluric grid theory was right? Isn't it possible that the ancients observed the electric phenomena around mountains, which was why they constructed all these gigantic structures, many of which we still can't effectively explain any other way? That aside, two of the most common objections to the power plant theory is that there's no evidence of devices or machinery that the electricity generated by the Great Pyramid would have been used to power in ancient Egypt, or that there were no follow-up groundbreaking inventions. However, there are two responses to that. The first is that the energy generated by the Great Pyramid might not have been used for machinery at all, but for spiritual purposes, somewhat like how Native Americans have their sacred places of power. The second response comes in the form of the Eola pile, a steam turbine invented around the 1st century AD that transformed steam into rotary motion, and proves that the ancients had, at least, a basic understanding of energy. Now, what they did with this understanding is where things get interesting, because they did nothing with it. The Eola pile remained little more than a curious toy for the entire period it was invented. The Mesoamerican wheel is even more curious. One would expect that a civilization with a wheel would go ahead to invent vehicles and whatnot. However, that was far from the case for the Mesoamericans, because even though they had wheels, these wheels were only used with kids' toys and never for carts or vehicles. That automatically makes the point about follow-up inventions moot, as humans evidently have a history of inventing and abandoning stuff, either because they don't know what to do with said invention, or because they don't just have the resources to make much out of it. But it also shows us that ultimately, technological advancements don't only happen because humans are getting smarter. There are other factors that foster technological advancements, including social, cultural, political, and economic factors. Long story short, the fact that the ancient Egyptians did not go on to invent more sophisticated machines and devices like later humans did shortly after inventing the light bulb may not be sufficient proof that they didn't have some knowledge of the light bulb or electricity in general. I'll end this video with a thought-provoking quote from Tesla. Whatever your thoughts about his pyramid theory, I think this quote is impossible to deny. It says, "All around, everything is spinning. Everything is moving everywhere there is energy. There must be some way of availing ourselves of this energy more directly. Then, with the light obtained from the medium, with the power derived from it, with every form of energy obtained without effort from the store forever inexhaustible, humanity will advance with giant strides. The mere contemplation of these magnificent possibilities expands our minds, strengthens our hopes, and fills our hearts with supreme delight."